Hi, I'm Stuart Lowe from Open Innovations, and I work on data projects. Now, my talk's about reducing website emissions, and you might not think that of websites as sources of CO2 emissions, but they are. All the data centers, the switches, the transmission networks, and the end devices that people use all use up electricity. And basically, the more data that you have to send over the network, and the more you have to process on the end user's device, the more electricity is used and the higher the emissions. And it's a problem that's getting worse. The median website is about 4 times as large as it was 10 years ago, according to httparchive.org. On mobile, they used to be much smaller than desktop pages, but now they're getting very similar to desktop pages. Now, not only is this bad for the environment, but it's also bad for those who have the most limited bandwidth, who are on very limited data plans. So it's got a social aspect to it as well. Now, with more and more councils and public bodies declaring things like climate emergencies, I wanted to see how they were doing in terms of their website. So I set about measuring them. So I used a really useful website called websitecarbon.com, and they released their code under an open license. So I could see how they created the website and automate it for a much larger number of websites. And they actually use Google PageSpeed. So I automated this for local authorities, UK universities, and UK central government organisations. And here are the results. So you can see I looked at 408 local authorities, 165 UK universities, and 582 central government organisations. And the mean for UK universities was nearly twice as bad as it was for the average UK website. But I've also included on here the worst offenders in each group. And the worst overall was a UK government organisation, which is UK Sport, and they had a 70 megabyte homepage, which ends up creating about 42 grams of CO2 per person per visit. So that's quite a lot, and there's quite a lot they can do to improve it. Now, actually, UK government organisations, their mean was the lowest out of the 3 groups, and they were much better than the UK average website. And that's largely down to so many of them being based on the GDS template, which tends to optimize things and keep things quite small. So well done to GDS for keeping the UK government organisations down in general. So I've made 3 separate websites for each of these categories, and on each there's a table listed from worst to best. And I don't like to just hit people over the head with a stick. Each individual organisation has its own webpage. Giving you a history of its emissions. I'm going to try and update this once a month. And then it also tells you the things that organisation can do to improve their homepage. So in the case of the London Borough of Newham, which is the worst local authority in terms of emissions from the homepage, it lists several images that they could shrink on their homepage and gives an estimate for how much smaller they'd be able to make them. Those are very conservative estimates, and in reality, you can make them a lot smaller. So there's useful specific tips for each organisation on what they can do, and then you can see if they've improved with time. So if you have a website, what can you do? Well, the biggest thing I found from all these groups was to improve images and videos on your website. So first of all, is the image even necessary? Do you need it to be there? Can you not have it and do something else instead? If you do have to use an image, is it an appropriately sized image for the area of the page that it's going to be on? Don't just take a picture straight off a digital camera and dump it on your website. That can typically be many megabytes in size. And so each user's got to download that to show on their page. Use responsive images if you can, so that adjusts this image to the right size for the screen area that it's used on. Perhaps you can use vector graphics instead of photographs for any graphical elements, and they might be smaller, but they also might be crisper and better on a higher resolution display anyway. Any PNG or JPEG or SVG images, see if you can minify them using one of these tools like Tiny PNG, Tiny JPEG, Short Pixel, or SVG Minify. They'll all help reduce the amount of metadata that's stored in the file that sometimes can be pretty big, surprisingly big. Also check if a modern image format such as WebP ends up smaller than a JPEG or a PNG image. That can make a big difference. And then reduce video usage. I've noticed more and more UK universities have started including giant background images on their homepages, and that is thought to be engaging, but it also adds a lot of bandwidth usage that people can't really opt out of. So don't autoplay videos as well. That's another tip. Fonts is something people don't necessarily think about, but every custom font you use on your page adds weight to the page. So try to use fewer font variations, limit it down to what you actually need, have fewer different weights of font. Also, the type of file that you use for the font makes a big difference. TTF and OTF fonts can be quite large, especially for all the variations, whereas WOFF and WOFF2 file formats tend to be much better. If you're using things like Google Fonts, it probably does already use WOFF and WOFF2. And then in terms of code, this is general advice anyway, write cleaner, shorter code for that's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you've got a content management system, try to avoid unnecessary plugins. A couple of years ago, Danny Van Kooten managed to save 59 kilograms of CO2 just by shortening a plugin that he wrote, which was used on lots of websites, and by making it a little bit smaller in file size and multiplied by the number of times it was used, made quite a big difference. Avoid unnecessary code libraries. Try to reduce the amount of JavaScript you use and use it more efficiently, because it affects both the transfer, sending it across the network, but also the processing at the end user's browser, especially if it's on a phone that can be using more power. Reduce the amount of tracking and advertising scripts, which especially on media websites can end up being very, very large and use a lot of processing. Also, maybe use static web pages. If your CMS is making lots of database lookups, that can add a lot of power usage at your server end. So maybe serve up static web pages. It also makes your website quicker doing all of this. And then you could also use progressive web app techniques to cache data, but browsers are getting better at that anyway. So how do you find out what to improve? Well, you can get tips from tools such as Lighthouse on Chrome, which is developer tools, or you can use Google's PageSpeed Insights, where you can type in your website address and it will give you all sorts of useful information about how you could improve the efficiency and speed of your website. So not only will that boost your Google rankings, but it will also help the environment and help those on lower data plans. So thanks for watching. Hopefully that gave you some food for thought about what you could do to improve your website. It might be an idea just to do an audit of your website every so often to check what level of CO2 emissions you have and how you could improve that with time. So here's a link to our projects page, which is about 60 times better than the average UK website in terms of CO2 emissions. Thank you.